We've spent an inordinate amount of time and effort trying to ensure that the Palestinian membership bid, which is premature, is not successful. Now, indeed, just for everybody to understand the process, it's a two-step process for any member state to join the United Nations. We just did it, by the way, last July with South Sudan. The first step is that you have to have an affirmative vote of the Security Council, 15 countries. You need at least 9 yes votes and no vetoes. And that then goes to the General Assembly, and in the General Assembly you need a 2/3 majority of all member states. Now the Palestinians know that if they get to the General Assembly, they'll have presumably 2/3 or very close to that. That's not the hurdle. The hurdle is getting through the Security Council. And of course, if need be, the United States could exercise its veto and prevent that from happening. And I think the President made clear our intentions should it come to that. But in fact, it has not come to that, and I don't think in the short term will come to that, because there are not 9 affirmative votes in the Security Council. Last year, before 2011, before the composition of the Security Council changes as it does every year, there were at least 7 countries that were not prepared to vote yes. And that would not, therefore, had a vote been called, the Palestinians wouldn't have crossed the key, I suppose, moral threshold of 9 affirmative votes. And the United States, in voting no, would not technically be exercising a veto. Now the composition of the Security Council has changed in 2012. 5 states rotated off last year, 5 new ones rotated on this year. And by our count, the vote is very much the same. So I think it would be, one can't exclude the possibility that the Palestinians, for whatever reason, might nonetheless seek a vote. But it's a vote that they're not going to succeed in winning, even in a moral sense. So that's one aspect of the challenge. Then, Julie, you mentioned, the Palestinian bid to go to other UN specialized agencies, as they did last year at UNESCO, the World Health Organization, the IAEA, many other UN agencies are out there on the horizon, and they each make their own decisions about who is granted member status. Very unfortunately, in our view, a rather last-minute initiative, the Palestinians quickly mustered the votes that they needed in the fall to join UNESCO. And that had 2 unfortunate consequences. One was that Palestinians were prematurely in an organization that is meant to be for member states, of which they're not one. And the second is that U.S. law, which has been on the books since the early 1990s, required that the United States cease all funding to UNESCO. We provided close to 25% of the funds to UNESCO. It was President George Bush who made the decision that the United States ought to rejoin UNESCO because of the good work it does on things like girls' education, Holocaust education, tsunami, global tsunami warning, and the like. And yet we were compelled by law, and we of course adhered to the law, to stop all U.S. funding. Within about a year, we will lose our vote in UNESCO as a result, in our voice and our ability to stand up as we have, not only for all these programs that serve our interests, but for many of the issues that matter most to Israel, which, as you know, there's a cultural war that's been waged on Israel via UNESCO, and we've managed over the years to thwart a number of them. But the risk is even greater when you get to organizations like the World Health Organization or the International Atomic Energy Agency, where life and death, American lives, depend on whether or not we're able to fund an agency that does such important work, for example, in pandemic detection and prevention, or in inspecting the nuclear programs in places like Iran or Syria. So we have a situation where a law designed to deter the Palestinians from going to these agencies, which made some sense in the early 1990s, is actually being used by the Palestinians for a double win. They get in the agencies and they get to knock us out over time. It's a self-defeating piece of legislation. It puts the gun in the hands of the Palestinians to hold against our head rather than empower us to make decisions about what's in our interest.
Thank you. You know, for those of us who have watched closely what's gone on over the past year, this has been such a shining example of the work of your team in the United Nations and the crucial nature of the United States having credibility with other partners in the UN to work together based on shared values in order to continue to do this work. So I want to thank you so much for this ongoing work and what it's meant. There's a follow-up question that I have. In a meeting last week, Prime Minister Fayyad told a small group of people that he thought that this is not an ideal time to continue the peace process because there are so many distractions in the world, whether it's turbulence in the Arab world, the elections that are pending here in the United States, and that he thought that what this would be is a time to build capacity of the Palestinian people to self-govern in the hopes that when the time comes around again that is more ripe for peacemaking, that they will have advanced their cause internally in order to do so. He was sort of an outlier in taking this position, and I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, first of all, Prime Minister Fayyad has very diligently and effectively, over the last several years, tried to build the capacity of the Palestinian Authority such that if one day it is able to assume the responsibilities of the state, it has more of the wherewithal to do so. And I think certainly we have supported and appreciated those efforts. But in our view, that does not mean that there ought to be some hiatus or holiday in the pursuit of peace. It's hard today, it was hard yesterday, and it undoubtedly will be hard tomorrow. And yes, what is happening in the region is unsettling to many in many respects. But I would think you could argue the flip side of that, which is that it increases the urgency in the interests of both Israel and the Palestinians that a lasting peace be found. And certainly that is our view, and that's what we remain very much committed to. As you know, the Jordanians have stepped in of late and tried to bring the two parties to direct discussions. There have been some preliminary discussions. They're now currently paused. But we very much appreciate Jordan's leading role in this, which is something that I think has emerged in part as a byproduct of the developments in the region. And we think that the discussions that began directly between the two sides were worthwhile, and we think they ought to continue because, frankly, there is no other way to deal with these critical issues than through direct negotiations. And that's the principle we fight every day to defend at the United Nations. And to the extent that there is real effort and progress, the things we're just talking about, like the premature Palestinian membership bid, the effort for observer status in the General Assembly, or admission to the other agencies, become more and more difficult for their sponsors to pursue. But for all the reasons that you know so well, to preserve in perpetuity the Jewish democratic nature of the State of Israel, to get the security and the permanent borders that Israel so deserves, and to end all claims, we need, for the sake of Israel and of course for the sake of the Palestinians, that these issues ultimately be resolved. And they only can be resolved through direct negotiations.